I remember the morning of my son's birthday like it was yesterday. The air in the house was buzzing with his laughter, the kind of sound that fills every corner with warmth. He woke up with a grin so wide it could melt the coldest heart, running around in his pajamas, pointing at the decorations I had stayed up half the night hanging. Streamers in his favorite colors danced from the ceiling, balloons bobbed lightly as he brushed past them, and a cake sat on the counter waiting to be cut, layered with frosting in the superhero theme he had begged for all month. He didn't need much to be happy, just the presence of those who said they loved him. That morning, he truly believed they would show up. I truly believed, deep down, they couldn't possibly disappoint him 2 years in a row. But as the hours began to crawl forward, reality started to sting. Every time the doorbell rang in my imagination, my son's eyes lit up with hope. He'd dart toward the window, peeking through the curtains with excitement, expecting to see a car pulling up or footsteps on the porch. But each time, nothing. Silence outside, no sound of laughter approaching, no cousins running to hug him. He looked at me, puzzled, asking when Grandma was coming, when his aunts and uncles would arrive. I forced a smile, my stomach twisting, telling him they were just running late. He believed me because children believe in the promises of adults. Children believe love means showing up. By the second hour, I had neatly arranged the plates, cups, and party favors, everything perfectly lined for the guests that never arrived. His favorite music playlist echoed through the house, upbeat songs that only emphasized the emptiness of the room. He danced for a moment, trying to keep the joy alive, and I clapped along, pretending nothing was wrong. But when he stopped and looked at the clock, confusion flickered across his face. He asked if maybe they had forgotten the time, maybe we told them the wrong day. His little voice cracked just slightly, but he tried to stay hopeful, waiting for the sound of someone knocking. I pulled out the candles, lit them on the cake, and asked if he wanted to blow them out just the two of us, but he shook his head. "I'll wait," he said with that innocent conviction only a child can carry. He thought his family loved him enough to walk through the door any second. I watched him sit by the window, legs swinging, clutching the small gift he had wrapped himself for his cousin, a gift he had saved his allowance to buy because he wanted to share his happiness. That unopened present sat in his lap for hours, a cruel reminder that not only had no one arrived, but no one even planned to. The phone stayed quiet. Not a single call. No text to say they were running late, no message to explain an emergency. The silence was worse than any excuse. By the 4th hour, I saw his energy start to dim. The balloons no longer held his attention, the music no longer made him dance. He laid on the couch, staring at the ceiling, holding his superhero figurine tightly, and whispered, "Maybe they don't like me." My heart broke into pieces I couldn't put back together. I wanted to scream, to cry, to call every single one of them and demand how they could do this to a child, but I didn't. Instead, I sat down beside him, stroking his hair, telling him over and over that he was loved, that he mattered. But children don't always believe words when actions prove otherwise. When the day finally drew to a close, we cut the cake alone. He blew out the candles with a quiet wish, eyes cast downward, and though I cheered loudly, the emptiness hung heavy in the air. The chairs stayed vacant, the plates unused, the food untouched. I cleaned up after him went to bed, his small voice asking if maybe they would come tomorrow instead. That question lingered in the air long after he fell asleep. I stared at the decorations, now lifeless, and felt an anger rising within me that I couldn't shake. Because this wasn't just a missed party. This was a pattern. A choice. And in their absence, they had broken something far more fragile than balloons or streamers. They had cracked a child's trust, a child's belief in his own worth to the people who should have been first in line to celebrate him. The morning after my son's birthday, I woke up to messages that felt more like slaps in the face than words of apology. A few of them trickled in late at night, just long enough to be labeled as technically remembered, yet hollow enough to prove they never cared. "Sorry, we couldn't make it, things got hectic. You know how busy life is, right? We'll do something next time." Each excuse was more pathetic than the last. It wasn't that they had forgotten, it was that they couldn't be bothered. That difference hit me like a brick. Forgetting implies a slip of the mind, but not showing up, without even a warning, showed deliberate disregard. I had heard the same tired lines before. The previous year, when no one came to his birthday, they swore it was a fluke. They promised it would never happen again. They reassured me that family always shows up for family, that they loved my son deeply, that I was overreacting to a one-time mistake. And like a fool, I believed them. I gave them the benefit of the doubt, thinking maybe I was being too sensitive, maybe they had valid reasons. But standing in that empty house again, watching my son blow out candles without his cousins or grandparents cheering him on, made their apologies echo like cruel jokes. They weren't sorry for what they did. They were sorry they got caught in their own indifference. I kept replaying their excuses in my head, each one weaker than the last. One sister claimed her car wasn't working, though she had posted pictures that same evening from a dinner across town with her friends. An uncle said he had a long week at work and just couldn't muster the energy, as though celebrating a child's birthday required Herculean strength. My mother, the one person who should have set the example, simply said she had other things going on. No detail, no explanation, just other things that apparently mattered more than her grandson. It wasn't the words themselves that cut the deepest. It was the realization that none of them had even tried. Not a single one of them made the effort to reschedule, to show up later, or even to call during the day to speak to him. They simply vanished and expected me to brush it off like it was nothing. What made it worse was the way they twisted the blame back on me when I dared to confront them. When I told them how crushed my son had been, their responses weren't filled with guilt or remorse. Instead, they said things like, "You know kids forget about these things quickly," or "You shouldn't put so much pressure on family events." As if I was the one blowing it out of proportion. As if my son's heartbreak, his silent disappointment, his whispered question of, "Maybe they don't like me," was something trivial enough to ignore. Their words carried the arrogance of people who know they failed, but refuse to admit it. What they didn't understand is that children don't just forget. They internalize. My son wasn't just sad because no one came. He was questioning whether he mattered at all to the very people who were supposed to love him unconditionally. And I had to sit there and watch him wrestle with emotions far too heavy for a child his age to carry. It enraged me that they could dismiss his feelings so casually, as though they hadn't just carved out a wound that would take more than a day to heal. The promises for next time rolled in like they always did. Each one empty. Each one designed to pacify me into silence. They would say, "We'll make it up to him," but I knew better. They wouldn't. They hadn't the year before, and they wouldn't the year after. Family who truly cared wouldn't need to make up for it because they would have been there in the first place. Their words were nothing more than flimsy bandages over a wound they refused to acknowledge. It was then I began to see the hypocrisy clearer than ever. These were the same people who constantly preached about the importance of family. The same ones who showed up for one another when it benefited them, who expected everyone to drop everything when they were hosting an event, who demanded loyalty and presence when it was their turn to be celebrated. I had seen them flood birthday parties for other relatives, laughing, taking pictures, showering them with gifts. Yet when it came to my son, their energy vanished. Their priorities shifted. It was as though he was invisible to them, a mere afterthought. The hypocrisy burned in my chest, heavy and suffocating, because their actions screamed the truth their words tried so desperately to hide. They simply did not value him the way they claimed. And yet, despite their blatant disregard, they still expected me to accept their apologies, to smile and move on, to pretend like everything was fine. They counted on my silence, on my desire to keep the peace. They assumed I would swallow the pain, just as I had before, and carry on as though nothing had happened. But inside me, something was shifting. The excuses weren't just flimsy anymore. They were insulting. They weren't just careless. They were deliberate reminders that in their world, my son didn't matter enough. And I couldn't let that slide again. For days after my son's birthday, when the house had already returned to its usual quiet routine, I heard a knock at the door. It startled me, because by then I had given up expecting anything from anyone. When I opened it, a delivery driver stood holding a large box wrapped in glossy paper, the kind of extravagant package you'd expect for a wedding or an anniversary. My first thought was confusion. Who could possibly be sending us something now? He handed it over with a polite smile, no sender information visible on the outside, just my name scribbled across the top in rushed handwriting. My son, curious as ever, came running to the door, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the unexpected gift. For a split second, his hope reignited, like the flame of a candle stubbornly refusing to die. We carried the box into the living room and set it on the table. The packaging was over-the-top bows, ribbons, shiny tape, all screaming of effort that had not been given when it actually mattered. My son clapped his hands together, imagining it was from one of his cousins, maybe something thoughtful and personal that showed they hadn't forgotten him after all. I watched his excitement carefully, because a part of me already sensed the bitter irony buried inside that package. I knew my family too well to trust the sudden generosity. Still, I let him help me peel back the wrapping, tearing through the layers with eager little hands, until the box finally opened. Inside, neatly stacked in tissue paper, was an expensive-looking toy set. Not his favorite superhero, not something that showed anyone had thought about what he actually liked, but rather the kind of generic high-priced item people buy when they want to appear caring without putting in the effort. It was flashy, yes, but it felt empty, disconnected from who my son really was. He picked it up slowly, his smile faltering just slightly as if he too felt the hollowness of it. He held it up, forcing enthusiasm, but I could tell he was trying to convince himself it meant more than it did. I didn't say anything, but my chest tightened as I stared at the receipt still tucked in the bottom of the box, proof that it had been purchased the day after his birthday. Not planned, not prepared, but rushed. An afterthought. Attached to the toy was a card. I pulled it out, unfolded it, and read the words aloud because my son asked me to. It said, "Sorry we couldn't be there. Hope this makes up for it. Happy belated birthday." No name signed, just a hurried scrawl, as if even the apology itself was too much effort to complete properly. My son nodded, quiet for a moment, then whispered, "They remembered." He wanted so badly to believe that this meant something, that the package was proof of love. I swallowed hard, fighting the lump in my throat, because I knew the truth that it wasn't love, it was guilt wrapped in pretty paper. The timing of it all made me furious. They couldn't spare a few hours to show up in person, to hug him, to cheer when he blew out his candles, to simply make him feel seen. But 4 days later, they could send a package as if that erased the disappointment, as if material things could replace memories that were never made. I kept imagining the conversations they must have had behind the scenes, maybe someone realizing too late how heartless it looked to ignore a child's birthday completely, maybe one person suggesting they send something so it doesn't look bad. It wasn't kindness that motivated them, it was image. Damage control. A box to cover their absence. What struck me hardest was the thought that if the roles had been reversed, if it had been one of their children, the effort would have been enormous. They would have planned weeks ahead, coordinated, posted endless pictures online about how much family means to them. But for my son, they thought a late package was enough. It stung deeper because it revealed the hierarchy of importance they had created, where my child always seemed to fall to the bottom. And here was the proof, sitting in a box on our table, a symbol of their selective love and their empty gestures. As I watched my son play with the toy, forcing joy because he didn't want me to see his doubt, I felt torn between gratitude that he had something new in his hands and anger that he had been denied the presents he truly wanted. Children don't crave gifts the way adults assume they do. They crave attention, laughter, shared moments. No toy, no matter how expensive, could replace the sound of his cousins singing to him, the warmth of his grandparents clapping as he blew out his candles, the silly games and chaos that come from a house full of family. That box was heavy, not with the toy inside, but with the weight of everything it represented, neglect disguised as generosity, absence wrapped in ribbon, betrayal softened by shiny paper. I couldn't help but wonder if they thought this would be enough to erase the memory of the empty chairs around the table, the untouched plates of food, the silence that swallowed what should have been laughter. Maybe they thought children forget, that a new toy would distract him, that he wouldn't notice the missing faces. But children notice. They may not always say it out loud, but they feel it in the pauses, in the quiet moments, in the way they look at the door waiting for it to open. This package didn't erase the pain, it highlighted it, made it clearer than ever that we were an afterthought in their world. When I looked deeper into that package and the so-called gesture that came 4 days too late, the hypocrisy began to unravel right before my eyes. It wasn't just the fact that they had sent it after the birthday had passed, or that it was clearly a rushed purchase meant to cover up their absence. It was the way they carried themselves afterward, as though sending a toy absolved them of everything. A few texts followed later in the week, full of smug undertones. Glad he got the gift, hope he liked it, and see, we didn't forget after all. They acted as if the package proved their loyalty, as if that one delivery erased the pain of an empty house on the very day that mattered most. Their words dripped with self-congratulation, like they expected me to praise them for finally doing the bare minimum, and it made my skin crawl. What really cut through me was the realization that the gift wasn't chosen with my son in mind at all. It was something they could show off. A toy set expensive enough to look impressive, but impersonal enough to prove they hadn't thought about who he was, what he loved, or what would make him feel special. They wanted to be seen as generous, without lifting the weight of true responsibility. To them, this wasn't about him, it was about appearances. They could boast about how they sent something, conveniently leaving out the part where they never showed up to begin with. And when I saw the receipt, dated days after his birthday, the truth was cemented. They hadn't planned to celebrate him. They hadn't forgotten. They had remembered and chosen not to come, only scrambling afterward when guilt, or perhaps fear of judgment, finally kicked in. The hypocrisy stretched even further when I thought about how they treated other children in the family. I had seen them go all out for birthdays that weren't even milestone years, decorating halls, organizing surprise parties, buying gifts so specific they clearly took weeks to plan. They made sure the entire family came together, posting photos on social media with captions about how much they value family and how children are the light of our lives. Yet when it came to my son, their effort evaporated. They couldn't be bothered to even pick up the phone on time. It wasn't about being busy, because I had seen where their time went: dinners, outings, events that apparently mattered more. It was about where they placed their priorities, and clearly, my child was never at the top of their list. What made the situation even uglier was how they tried to spin the narrative when I confronted them. I pointed out how hurtful it was that they hadn't shown up, how my son had sat by the window waiting all day. Instead of acknowledging their failure, they leaned on the gift as a shield. But we sent him something, they argued, as if a late package could stand in for their absence. He liked it, didn't he? That's what matters. The way they said it made my blood boil, because they were trying to rewrite the story into one where they were the heroes who saved the day with their belated generosity. They wanted me to pretend along with them, to act grateful, to ignore the truth in exchange for a box that cost them more money than effort. I saw through every word, every excuse, every half-hearted attempt at deflection. It wasn't just neglect, it was arrogance. They believed their actions carried no consequences, that they could disappoint a child, hurt him deeply, and then toss a material apology into the mix and walk away clean. They thought their version of love was enough, even if it came 4 days late, even if it came in a form that was hollow and self-serving. They wanted credit without commitment, recognition without sacrifice. The deeper I thought about it, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't the first time they had tried to hide their lack of care behind superficial gestures. They had done it on holidays, on other important milestones, always skipping the parts that required genuine presence, and then throwing something shiny into the mix to make themselves look better. The problem was that this time, they couldn't hide from the raw truth of a child's heartbreak. I had watched my son's face crumble when no one came, heard the doubt in his voice when he questioned his own worth, and no package in the world could undo that. Their hypocrisy stood exposed, undeniable, and for the first time, I refused to let it slide. They didn't want to face the reality that their actions screamed louder than their words ever could. They wanted me to help them uphold the illusion, to nod politely and accept their narrative. But I couldn't. Because when I looked at that package, I didn't see generosity. I saw guilt, shame, and an attempt to silence me with material distraction. I saw people who wanted to look like family without acting like it. I saw people who thought so little of us that they believed a box arriving days later would be enough to buy back the respect they had already lost. And the bitter truth that they didn't want to admit was that the gift wasn't for my son, it was for themselves. It was their way of soothing their conscience, of protecting their reputation, of convincing themselves they hadn't done anything wrong. They didn't care that he had spent his birthday in tears, that he had sat waiting until the sun went down. They only cared about making themselves feel better afterward. That package was their bandage, their attempt to paint over the cracks they had created, but all it did was expose just how shallow their version of family really was. After the gift arrived and their smug messages tried to rewrite the narrative, I realized I had a choice to make. I could let this cycle continue, allowing them to ghost my son's milestones while throwing crumbs of shallow effort afterward, or I could finally take a stand. The more I thought about it, the more I knew I couldn't allow them to keep doing this to him. I had been silent before, brushing off their absence to avoid conflict, convincing myself that maintaining peace was more important than confrontation. But watching my son's trust erode piece by piece, watching him question his worth to people who were supposed to love him unconditionally, was the breaking point. Something inside me hardened, a resolve I hadn't felt before, and I knew it was time to turn the tables. I didn't come to that decision out of anger alone. It came from the quiet moments after his birthday, when he would look at me with questions I couldn't answer. He asked why no one came, if maybe they forgot, if maybe he wasn't as important as the other kids. Each question felt like a dagger, not because of what he said, but because of the way he said it, with innocence that deserved honesty, yet with heartbreak that honesty would only deepen. I realized that protecting him wasn't about sugarcoating their behavior anymore. It was about showing him that he mattered enough for me to fight for him. I couldn't make them love him the way they should, but I could make sure he never had to sit by a window waiting for people who chose not to come. My first step wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, deliberate, and calculated. I began to distance myself and my son from the family's gatherings. Invitations came, and I politely declined. Group chats buzzed with plans, and I stayed silent. When questioned, I simply said we were busy, mirroring the very excuses they had used on us. At first, they didn't notice, too wrapped up in their own worlds to realize we were no longer orbiting around them. But over time, they began to sense the shift. They asked why we weren't joining, why I seemed distant, why I wasn't as available as before. And for once, I didn't offer them comfort. I let them feel the sting of absence, the same sting they had inflicted on a child without remorse. The second step was more direct. I stopped shielding them from accountability. When someone tried to boast about the gift they had sent, I responded bluntly, yes, he got it. For days after his birthday. After sitting alone all day. The silence that followed was sharp, and I let it linger. They were not used to me speaking so plainly, not used to me refusing to play the role of peacemaker. But I had realized something powerful. Silence had only ever protected them, never my son. By naming the truth out loud, I shifted the balance. They could no longer hide behind their excuses without being exposed. I also began to redirect my energy. Instead of waiting for them to step up, I poured myself into creating moments that mattered for my son. I invited his friends from school, organized outings, built traditions that didn't rely on unreliable relatives. I showed him that family isn't defined by shared blood, but by the people who actually show up, who choose you over and over again. It wasn't about replacing the absence of others, but about teaching him that love and care exist beyond the narrow circle of people who had failed him. The more I did this, the less power their neglect held over us. Of course, my family didn't take kindly to my shift. They accused me of being dramatic, of holding grudges, of poisoning my son against them. But I didn't need to poison anything. Their actions spoke louder than I ever could. I reminded them of the empty chairs at his party, of the unopened plates, of the silence that filled the house while my son waited. If they thought that a late package could erase that, then they didn't understand the first thing about what it meant to be family. Their defensiveness only proved that they weren't sorry, they were just uncomfortable with being called out. Turning the tables wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about reclaiming power they had taken from us through neglect. It was about showing them that their absence no longer had the ability to dictate my son's happiness or define his worth. Each time I stood firm, each time I refused to cover up for them, I could see a change in my son too. He stopped asking when they would show up. He stopped waiting by the window. He began to understand that their behavior was not a reflection of him, but of them. That shift was the greatest victory of all, because it meant their neglect no longer held him hostage. When they finally began to realize that I wasn't bending, that I wasn't willing to smooth things over this time, their tone changed. Some tried to guilt-trip me, saying I was tearing the family apart. Others tried to manipulate me with half apologies, dripping with insincerity. But I didn't waver. I had spent too many years cushioning their blows, too many years softening the reality of their selfishness. This time, I wanted them to feel the weight of their actions. I wanted them to see that the cycle had ended, that I wasn't going to let them ghost my son's milestones while pretending everything was fine. In the end, my choice to turn the tables wasn't about punishing them, it was about protecting him. It was about teaching him that he was worthy of more than half-hearted excuses and last-minute gestures. It was about proving, to both of us, that we didn't need their approval or their presence to create joy. And while they scrambled to control the story, I stood firm in mine, finally refusing to let them dictate how much my son's happiness was worth. When the dust finally began to settle, and the sting of that empty birthday had dulled into a steady ache, I made a promise to myself and to my son. I wouldn't let their neglect define our memories anymore. If my family wanted to treat him like an afterthought, then I would create moments so powerful that their absence would become irrelevant. But I also knew that letting them walk away unchallenged would only teach them that their behavior carried no consequences. That's when I decided it was time for them to feel the sting of their own choices. The sweet taste of revenge wasn't about hurting them the way they had hurt us, it was about reclaiming the narrative, making sure they understood that their actions had a price, and showing my son that silence in the face of cruelty was no longer an option. My revenge didn't come in a loud, dramatic explosion. It came in calculated, deliberate ways that exposed their hypocrisy. The first step was making their absence visible. Whenever someone asked how the birthday went, I didn't sugarcoat it anymore. I told the truth plainly. He sat alone all day, waiting, and no one showed. I let their shame hang in the air like a shadow they couldn't escape. Word spread quickly through extended relatives and friends, and soon they could no longer hide behind their excuses. Their shiny package, their late gesture, was seen for exactly what it was, a cover-up. The whispers reached them, and I could feel their discomfort. For once, they weren't the ones controlling the story. The second layer of my revenge was exclusion. Just as they had excluded my son from his own celebration, I began excluding them from the moments they craved. When holidays rolled around, I didn't extend invitations. When milestones came, school performances, sports games, little celebrations, I kept them out of the loop. Pictures I would once have shared in the family group chat stayed private or went directly to people who genuinely cared. They noticed. Their texts shifted from casual chatter to pointed questions. Why weren't we invited? Why didn't you tell us? And I answered with the same nonchalance they had given us. We were busy. It slipped my mind. Maybe next time. They tasted the same indifference they had so easily dished out, and I savored every second of it. But the sweetest part was watching how the shift in attention rattled them. They had always assumed I would keep running back, desperate for their approval, willing to forgive whatever crumbs they offered. Instead, I poured my energy into people who actually valued us, neighbors, close friends, even parents of my son's classmates who stepped up when blood relatives fell short. Suddenly, the pictures I posted online weren't of my son surrounded by cousins who barely acknowledged him, but by genuine friends who cheered him on, who showed up without hesitation. The contrast was glaring. My family, who had prided themselves on appearances, couldn't stand being replaced in the narrative they thought they owned. There was also a deeper, more personal layer to the revenge. I stopped protecting them in my son's eyes. For years, I had softened the blow, telling him things like, they're just busy, or they love you, they just couldn't make it. But now I told the truth in words a child could understand. I told him that some people choose not to show up, not because he isn't worthy, but because they don't know how to love the right way. I told him that real family is proven by action, not just by words or gifts. Watching him slowly absorb that truth was painful, but it was also liberating. He began to see their absence for what it was, and instead of blaming himself, he learned to place the responsibility where it belonged on them. That shift in perspective was revenge enough, because it robbed them of the power to break him again. Over time, they tried to win their way back. Invitations came from their side, dripping with insincerity. They wanted me to fold, to let bygones be bygones, to once again allow them into our lives on their terms. But I didn't give them what they wanted. I responded with polite distance, never hostility, but never warmth either. My restraint became its own form of vengeance. They couldn't accuse me of being cruel, but they couldn't deny that I had stripped them of the privilege of being part of our lives. Every time they tried to guilt me, every time they tried to twist the story into one where I was the problem, I reminded myself that they had written their own ending the moment they chose not to show up for him. The real victory came in the small, quiet moments with my son. Watching him celebrate with people who truly cared, seeing his smile untainted by disappointment, hearing his laughter ring through the house without the weight of expectation, it was proof that I had succeeded. The revenge wasn't about punishing my family anymore. It was about ensuring my son never again had to measure his worth by their absence. Their regret, their discomfort, their scrambling attempts to save face were just icing on the cake. The true sweetness came from reclaiming our joy, on our terms, without them hovering over us like they were doing us a favor. And as they sat in the distance, watching the life they had excluded themselves from, they were forced to face the truth they had spent years avoiding. They were no longer the center of our world. They were outsiders, peering in at what they could have had if they had only chosen to show up. Their belated package sat in a corner, collecting dust, while my son thrived without them. That was the sweetest revenge of all, not their suffering, but our freedom.